Hey there. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This spaceship traveled through space for an astonishing 923 years, but upon landing, a shocking discovery was made: the entire crew had mutated. Today, we'll be recapping the story of the 2009 movie Pandorum. In 2153, a space probe identified Tanis, a distant planet capable of sustaining life. At that time, Earth was overpopulated, with more than 24 billion people, leading to severe shortages of food and essential resources. 20 years later, the battle for survival intensified, pushing humanity to launch the Elysium spacecraft toward Tanis in search of a new home. The colossal vessel had been journeying through deep space when the crew received a devastating transmission from Earth. They and the passengers aboard Elysium were humanity's last survivors. Time passed an unknown period until a man suddenly awakened from hypersleep. Disoriented, he gasped for air, convulsing and screaming, but no one responded. The capsule's label identified him as Corporal Bauer. Struggling, he finally cut the wires and stumbled out. Covered in mucus and with catheters still attached, he barely remembered anything. Electrical failures plagued the ship, forcing Bauer to grab a flashlight and search his surroundings. He soon discovered another stasis pod, this one belonging to Lieutenant Payton. The name seemed vaguely familiar. Bauer, now dressed in his uniform, found a picture of his wife in his locker. Attempting to reach the captain's bridge, he was met with a sealed door. Frustrated, he grabbed a metal rod and struck Payton's pod, but there was no response. Suddenly, a surge of electricity jolted through the ship, and Payton's pod opened on its own. Dazed, Payton also struggled to recall anything. They assumed their shift had just begun, yet something felt eerily wrong. Why hadn't anyone woken them? Bauer suspected they were alone, awakened only by the navigation system, yet neither of them could remember their mission or destination. With no power to access the bridge, Payton activated backup energy in their quarters and attempted to radio for help. Meanwhile, Bauer discovered a tattoo on his arm, marking him as part of Group 5. But what had happened to Group 4, who should have been preparing for hibernation? And where was their missing teammate, Lieutenant Cooper? His capsule was empty. Suddenly, strange sounds echoed from the ventilation system. Payton suggested Bauer climb inside to investigate. Armed with a communication transmitter, Bauer crawled into the vent while Payton monitored his movements. As he advanced, power fluctuations worsened, signaling that the ship's nuclear reactor was failing and needed a reboot. The narrow passage made breathing difficult. Anxiety crept in. Payton calmed him with humor, reminding him that each shift was supposed to last 2 years, meaning only 8 years should have passed since the voyage began. Then, Bauer plummeted down the shaft, landing near a vent hatch on the lower level. Shining his flashlight, he was horrified to see Lieutenant Cooper's corpse, stuck for what seemed like years. Kicking the hatch open, Bauer tumbled into another compartment. His connection with Payton was lost. As he explored, Bauer found rows of stasis pods and heard eerie clanking noises. A shadowy figure darted past. Chasing after it, he soon realized it wasn't a girl but a man, long dead by his own hands. Before he could react, a feral woman attacked, forcing him to remove his shoes. But a terrifying growl in the hallway sent her running. Then, Bauer saw them: twisted, monstrous creatures lurking in the darkness. He quickly shut off his flashlight and hid in the shadows. A monstrous figure charged through the corridor, its spiked fangs glinting as it sniffed the air, searching for him. Holding his breath, Bauer remained still, praying it wouldn't find him. At that moment, the connection with Payton is restored, and he urgently calls Bauer to the phone. His loud call reveals Bauer's presence, prompting the monster to attack with its spear. However, Bauer presses himself against the wall and manages to avoid injury. The monster soon departs, carrying the lifeless body of Lieutenant Cooper. Terrified, Bauer contacts the commander and frantically recounts what happened, pleading for him to call a rescue team by any means possible. But Payton remains grim: rescue is futile. He recalls a critical detail: Elysium was never designed to turn back. The passengers, all 60,000 of them, are simply cargo on a one-way journey to Tanis. Hearing this, Bauer is flooded with memories. He recalls watching a live broadcast with his parents when the first probe landed on Tanis, revealing an environment rich with water, plants, and all the essentials for sustaining human life. That moment marked the decision to send settlers to Tanis. Realization dawns on him: Elysium is a point of no return voyage. Thoughts of his wife consume him, yet he cannot recall whether she, 2, is aboard the ship. Anxious and desperate, he resolves to find her before the monsters do. Payton urges Bauer to focus on saving the ship. Taking his advice, Bauer arms himself with a non-lethal weapon and asks Payton to guide him to the reactor for a manual restart. As he sets off, an unsettling sensation creeps over him, a strange unease, almost as if the early signs of the space-induced insanity known as Pandorum are taking hold. He remembers the infamous case of an officer stationed on the spaceship Eden, who, after a 2-year shift, succumbed to madness. Convinced their mission was cursed, he ejected 5,000 passengers into the void of space, sealing their fate. Bauer shakes off the disturbing thought and pushes forward. As he moves through the corridor, he stumbles upon an unconscious man. Suddenly, the stranger regains awareness, and Bauer helps him up. The man belongs to the 6th group and, for reasons unknown, has been awake for a long time. Realizing Bauer is unaware of the ship's situation, he hurriedly smears a brown liquid over his body, a method to mask their scent from the monsters. Just then, a guttural growl echoes nearby. The two men bolt, seeking cover. However, the creatures locate the 6th group officer and drag him away. Bauer tries to intervene but is powerless to stop them. Left with no choice, he flees. Sprinting through the corridors, he stumbles and plummets from a great height, narrowly saving himself by clutching onto a rope. His transmitter falls from the ledge, severing communication with Payton. As the monsters close in, a swift warrior armed with a spear suddenly appears, rescuing Bauer at the last moment. The two retreat behind the doors of a compartment, safe for now. The stranger introduces himself as Meng. Though he speaks a language Bauer cannot understand, his demeanor is friendly. A tattoo on Meng's arm identifies him as part of the agriculture team. Bauer proceeds to the ship's food storage, where he is ambushed by the agile girl he encountered earlier. Before she can strike, Meng intervenes, engaging her in combat. Bauer fires his weapon into the air, startling them both. He insists they must work together and persuades them to escort him to the reactor. Meng signals that he knows the way. As they begin their journey, the monstrous growls return, prompting them to move quickly. The girl introduces herself as Nadia. She warns that no one who has ventured toward the reactor has ever come back. Bauer remains resolute, saving the ship is the only way forward. Gaining her trust, he learns that she awoke 6 months ago. Arriving at a locked door, Nadia places her hand on the scanner and waits. The monsters draw nearer, but she urges patience. When the door finally opens, the group fights off their pursuers and escapes into a brightly lit chamber, the environmental compartment. Nadia reveals that she has lived here, tending to the embryos of animals and plants meant to populate Tanis. On Earth, she was a geneticist, part of a team that spent 7 years gathering biosphere samples to recreate life on the new planet. Listening to her, Bauer recalls that the journey from Earth to Tanis takes 123 years. Nadia offers him a cricket to eat, suggesting that Elysium has been in transit for far longer than just 8 years. Meanwhile, Payton struggles to breach the captain's bridge. A strange sound from the ventilation system puts him on edge, prompting him to seal the hatch. Moments later, the noise returns. This time, it is not a monster but a man emaciated, drenched in an eerie slime who emerges from the vent. Begging for help, he introduces himself as Corporal Gallow of the 4th group. Disoriented and trembling, Gallow claims he was on the captain's bridge before inexplicably ending up in his current state. Back with Bauer and his team, they arrive at the crew's cryogenic bay, only to find most of the pods empty. According to Nadia, the missing people were taken by the creatures. Meng remains cautious, lingering among the pods. As Bauer approaches him, the floor beneath him suddenly gives way, sending him tumbling down. Nadia follows after him. They land waist-deep in a murky liquid, surrounded by filth. Above them, a monster prowls the cryochambers but soon disappears. Carefully, the pair make their way back up. As Bauer sweeps his flashlight across the area, the creature lunges. Trapped in a tangle of wires, Bauer begins to succumb to the symptoms of Pandorum. But when he sees Nadia struggling against the monster, he regains clarity and rushes to her aid. A vicious battle ensues. As Bauer and Nadia are forced to the ground, Meng reappears, and together, they launch a coordinated assault. Just as they gain the upper hand, a second monster arrives, slamming its spear against the wall. The sound summons a swarm of its kind. Without hesitation, the trio turn and flee. Payton brings Gallow back to his senses and questions him about what happened on the bridge. Gallow explains that 2 of his teammates were possessed by the Pandorum, forcing him to defend himself. However, Payton remains skeptical. Meanwhile, Nadia continues leading her group toward the reactor when they come across a small, inconspicuous cabin with a closing hatch. Exhausted from the recent monster attack, they decide to rest there. Inside, they encounter a man named Leland, who switches on the lights and reveals that he has been living in the cabin for a long time. He prepares a meal for them, while Bauer and Nadia discuss the origins of the monsters aboard the ship. Nadia believes that these creatures were once humans in cryosleep but mutated due to an accelerator, a synthetic enzyme meant to help humans adapt to Tannis biosphere. Instead, it enabled the monsters to thrive aboard the ship. Overhearing their conversation, Leland decides to share what he knows. At the same time, Gallow, now fully conscious, begins tormenting Payton, listing the symptoms of Pandorum and urging him to recognize them in himself. As he prepares to reveal a terrifying truth, his story parallels Leland's own account. Leland recounts that when the Elysium mission began, all passengers were in cryosleep, while the crew rotated every 2 years. Initially, everything proceeded smoothly until the 4th crew rotation. They received a final transmission from Earth. An apocalyptic event had wiped out life, making the Elysium's passengers the last surviving humans. The only ones awake at that moment were Gallow and his 2 colleagues. In the aftermath of the transmission, chaos erupted. Gallow slaughtered his fellow crew members and, left alone, began awakening random passengers, subjecting them to his twisted amusement. Over time, he saw himself as a ruler, eliminating those who resisted. Eventually, he grew bored and returned to cryosleep, while those he had awakened continued mutating, spreading terror throughout the ship. As Leland shares his story, Bauer and his team suddenly lose consciousness. Leland had poisoned their food. Payton also struggles to process the shocking revelation that Earth is gone and the Elysium is in complete disarray. The psychological strain makes him exhibit symptoms of Pandorum, while Gallow intensifies his manipulation, hypnotizing him with a frenzied gaze. Meanwhile, a power surge jolts Bauer and his team awake. They find themselves hanging upside down, bound by Leland, who has grim plans for them. Bauer pleads with Leland, explaining the urgency of restarting the reactor. Though skeptical after years of survival among monsters, Leland acknowledges the increasing power fluctuations, an indication that the reactor is nearing failure, which would spell doom for the entire ship. Convinced by Bauer's determination, Leland releases them. Bauer reassures his team of their unity and contacts Payton via Leland's radio. Based on Bauer's calculations, Payton determines they have only 47 minutes to restore the reactor. He maps out a route, and the group sets off. As they navigate the ship, they encounter a baby mutant. Meng attempts to kill it, but Nadia pleads for mercy. However, the creature immediately shrieks, summoning adult mutants. The team barely escapes as a horde of monsters gives chase. Meanwhile, Payton remains determined to reach the captain's bridge, but Gallow cynically taunts him, claiming Bauer has lost his skills due to prolonged cryosleep and cannot restart the reactor. Gallow insists that their only chance of survival is to eject from the ship and live a few more days. Bauer's team reaches a compartment meant for crew families, only to find the capsules empty. He suddenly recalls that his wife was never on board. She had stayed behind on Earth, choosing to let him go without regret, ultimately saving his life. His memories trigger another realization about Payton. As they press on, they reach the reactor. Gallow attempts to convince Payton that the reactor won't withstand a reboot, but Payton silences him, determined to let Bauer fix the issue. Bauer carefully crosses a fragile bridge leading to the reactor, but the structure gives way, waking a sleeping monster from the nest below. Hundreds of mutants lie dormant, absorbing radiation. The disturbed creature briefly growls but soon drifts back to sleep. Bauer continues forward, but the bridge suddenly collapses. Meng manages to grab it just in time, preventing Bauer from plummeting into the pit. However, Bauer still falls dangerously close to the mutants. Nadia reaches the reactor and initiates the restart process but requires Bauer's assistance to complete it. To avoid detection, Bauer camouflages himself with mutant skin, masking his human scent. Meanwhile, tensions escalate between Payton and Gallow. Gallow, now completely unhinged, forces Payton to initiate an escape sequence. He points a tranquilizer gun at him, compelling him to eject the capsule. However, Payton deceives him by launching a simulated catapult and locking Gallow inside. Enraged, Gallow screams in frustration. Back at the reactor, Bauer cautiously makes his way through the sleeping mutants, but Leland accidentally drops his flashlight, waking the creatures. The mutants begin growling and searching for the disturbance. Bauer hastens his escape, and Meng finally releases the broken bridge into the pit, crushing several mutants. However, those that survive charge toward Meng. He hurls his spear at them and flees. With mere seconds left before the reactor shuts down, Bauer successfully restarts it, sending the mutants into a frenzy. Leland, witnessing the chaos, rushes toward the captain's bridge. Payton prepares to move to the control center when Gallow, still trapped in the capsule, cryptically taunts him, calling him a corporal and accusing him of past sins. Meanwhile, Bauer and Nadia wait for the monsters to settle before escaping the reactor room. Meng, however, encounters the mutant leader and engages in a brutal fight. Though the monster is strong, Meng ultimately kills it using its own weapon. As he catches his breath, he notices the baby mutant again. Initially appearing harmless, the creature suddenly slashes Meng's throat with a swift strike, killing him instantly. Back at the captain's bridge, Gallow manages to escape the capsule and confronts Payton with a loaded tranquilizer gun. Payton experiences a surreal moment of double vision as they struggle. Suddenly, their bodies appear to merge. After being injected with the tranquilizer, Gallow vanishes completely, and Payton feels an overwhelming sense of relief. Just then, Leland arrives at the bridge, eager to share his experiences. However, Payton swiftly eliminates him. Nadia and Bauer finally reach the control room, where Bauer begins to realize that Payton isn't who he claims to be. The supposed lieutenant, now seated in the captain's chair, acknowledges the truth: he is actually Corporal Gallow. It was Gallow who received the final transmission from Earth, killed his crew, and remained awake while others entered anabiosis. He was also responsible for triggering the mutation of Elysium's passengers. After indulging in chaos for decades, he eventually put himself into anabiosis only in someone else's capsule, the one originally belonging to Lieutenant Payton. Gallow opens the viewing window, but instead of stars, only darkness greets them. As Nadia tries to determine their location, Gallow attempts to push Bauer into succumbing to Pandorum, glorifying fear and the abandonment of morality. He argues that with Earth gone, laws and ethics are meaningless. But Bauer refuses to accept this. Suddenly, Nadia spots sea creatures outside, realizing that the ship is submerged on Tanis, their intended destination. The logbook reveals that the journey lasted 923 years, far beyond the intended 123. The passengers could have awakened centuries ago and lived on Tanis without mutating. Upon this realization, Bauer experiences a Pandorum attack and, in a panic, fires at an electrical panel. The resulting damage causes the ship's hull to crack, and water begins rushing in. Bauer grabs Nadia and rushes her into a pod, launching it just as a mutant tries to attack. The rising water halts the creature, and the pod rapidly ascends. As they struggle to breathe, Bauer places an oxygen mask on Nadia, holding his own breath until they reach the surface. The hatch bursts open, revealing land ahead. Soon, thousands of intact survival pods emerge from the ocean, automatically ejected due to the ship's breach. Meanwhile, Gallow and the remaining mutants are left behind, sinking with the Elysium. Thus begins the first day of life on Tanis. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.